Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you in this important webinar on Charles Taylor and the myth of the secular. He's one of my favorite philosophers today. I'm Dr. Gordon E. Karkner, a meta-educator with UBC postgraduate students, author, blogger, and YouTube webinar producer. And it's great to be building this series, building out from our project. And our motto is never stop thinking. What's our trajectory for today? Who is Charles Taylor? Three views of secularity, the immanent frame defined, the closed immanent frame, or CWS, closed world system, transcendence and the open immanent frame, two ways of seeing reality or two takes on reality, epistemological and hermeneutical, some conclusions, and then finishing up with a bit of bibliography. So who is Charles Taylor? His famous motto is, our philosophical narrative is vital to our self-understanding. We need to know where we've come from, especially as Westerners, in order to know who we are and where we're going. He is one of the most respected philosophers alive in the Western world, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at McGill University. Richard Rorty called him one of the top 12 philosophers in the world today. I want to focus, the focus of this session draws on three major tomes of interest: Source of the Self, A Secular Age, and The Language Animal. He's what you call a big picture thinker. His PhD was under Iris Murdoch at All Souls College in Oxford. And that's where he learned something about the idea of the transcendent good from Murdoch. The core theme of his landmark 2007 tome, A Secular Age, which won a Templeton Prize, is to study the fate of religious faith in the strong sense in the West over the past 500 years. A, belief in a transcendent reality, and B, the connected aspiration of personal transformation, which goes beyond ordinary human flourishing. This word will come up again and again. Our focus will be on chapter 15 of that book, called The Immanent Frame. So Taylor actually shows us that rather than one view of the secular, there are actually three views of the secular, of our secular age, or secularity. One, in the classical or medieval accounts, secular meant the world at large, our regular vocations, the temporal realm we live in. That's called secularity one. Most people believe in God in the Middle Ages, as you might know. And big changes developed since 1500 CE to the present era. That's the period that he covers in A Secular Age, the transition in philosophical outlook during that time. It's quite a tome, 700 pages. More power to you if you want to read that. Second is secularity two. This view is that religion in modernity has been replaced by science and is no longer needed. Now that we have come of age in our thinking, in our outlook, we've come to maturity. The immanent frame in this view is closed to the transcendent, to God, religion, and higher meaning. This is the view assumed by the secularization thesis. Secularity, in this case, speaks of a neutral, a-religious space and reason that is uncontestable. In other words, it is assuming that this is axiomatic, just the way the world is. And now secularity three. This is a more complex world where we live within the immanent frame, but many still reach out for the transcendent, for God, agape love, personal transformation, etc. The idea of secularity sees that religious and secular people coexist. They cope with the tensions between belief and unbelief. That's the age we're in. We're in the age of tension between belief and unbelief. And also, belief in God is just one belief among others. We know this as the age of pluralism. Both religion and the secular, or atheism, materialism, are contested beliefs. There's no final settling of the score on this discussion. And a good place to see this is in Dostoevsky, Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, where this ongoing debate between belief and unbelief in culture goes on. The insight here is that the plausibility structures of our very society change through time. So what is it about the plausibility structures that give these three different views of the secular in three different eras? Now we move to the topic of the immanent frame, or how we see ourselves. I guess you could say the kind of shape of the world we think we live within. He uses the term box, or image of a box, and that's maybe helpful. What is in our box? The immanent frame describes the way in which we have located or how we perceive ourselves in the late modern world. It's a picture that has taken our minds and our hearts captive, punting to Wittgenstein. Our social imaginary, in this case, is limited to the time, space, energy, matter world. And the social imaginary includes the way people imagine their social existence, their lived experience, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them. It is often carried in images, stories, and legends. On the other hand, Taylor wants to explore, or what you would say, re-articulate the plausibility of the life-nurturing, transcendent dimensions of human culture. He does not believe that all citizens of late modernity need to deny the possibility of the transcendent within this immanent frame, to constrict their thinking to a horizontal dimension. And in fact, he says, the demise of God has been announced far too early. Many today are on a serious spiritual quest around the world. Further, we want to define in more detail this immanent frame. It operates within a disenchanted world where supernatural beings or forces with teleological goals or intentions are deemed close to impossible. Final causes are eliminated from the picture. With this immanent frame, there's a loss of cosmic order. Everything important is this worldly, explicable on its own terms. Social and political orders are constructed by humans solely for mutual benefit, not to please a divine entity. Society is made up of individuals, that's the normative element. Each human is charged with finding their own way of being human. This is part of what he calls the age of authenticity. And the Nova effect is that several different spiritual paths are pursued as a normal course, and every individual has become the measure of the good, autonomos. The immanent frame contains a hard moral outlook, despite what some people think. It includes some things, values such as secular time, and excludes others, language related to eternity, epiphany, etc. It renders vertical or transcendent worlds as either inaccessible or unthinkable. It operates within a philosophically reductionist stance, as we will see. Taylor calls this moral position exclusive humanism. So he sees that as a moral commitment, an act of faith of sorts. Here's a key quote from him. So the buffered identity of the disciplined individual moves in a constructed social space where instrumental rationality is a key value and time is pervasively secular. All of this makes up what I want to call the immanent frame. There remains to add just one background idea, that this frame constitutes a natural order to be contrasted with a supernatural one. an immanent world over against a possible transcendent one. Now, a key qualifier here at this point is to say that Taylor shows that there is both the closed and open version of the immanent frame. And that's key to our discussion of the secular, the myth of the secular. So first of all, we want to focus on the closed immanent frame or exclusive humanism. And remember, we talked about secularity too. We can come to see the growth of civilization or modernity as synonymous with the laying out of a closed immanent frame. Within this, civilized values develop in a single-minded focus on the human good, aided by a fuller and fuller use of scientific reason, permits the greatest flourishing possible of human beings. Religion not only menaces these goals with its fanaticism, but it also undercuts reason, which comes to be seen rigorously requiring scientific materialism, says Taylor. And here's the values hierarchy in the closed immanent frame. In secularity too, God and religion are at the bottom of important things to be valued. CWS, or the closed world system, settles into a strong bias, or what Taylor calls a blick. It can make us both blind and inarticulate concerning certain aspects of reality by the very nature of how it unconsciously shapes our viewpoint or analysis. Indeed, Taylor shows how religion has been philosophically and culturally marginalized in this closed box immanent frame, this mentality. Even while religious values, virtues, and practices are in resurgence globally, there is a heavy emphasis on human goods or flourishing, which replaces God, rights, freedoms, equality, democracy. Or human flourishing really speaks about what is a life worth living. We can get a handle on some important discussion or dialogue around this idea. What does it mean to flourish as a human being? You may have read the book by Miroslav Volf called Flourishing, where he talks about that as well, following Taylor, of course. CWS, or the closed world system, is actually a subtraction thesis. The Western master narrative is deeply embedded in our consciousness. It contains the idea that with the flourishing of science, especially since the 18th century, you get the elimination of religion. The growth of science entails the death of God and the retreat of religion from societal influence. Science itself is taken as secularity too, or pure secularism. This means science must bring secularity in its train, as many thinkers contend. It is only, says Taylor, it is only within some understanding of agency in which disengaged scientific inquiry is woven into a story of courageous adulthood to be tamed through a renunciation of the more childish comforts in meaning and beatitude that the death of God appears obvious. And that's important. The frame affects what we can see in the world. But what is the hermeneutical weight of this position? Taylor deconstructs it as a non-obvious, unproven bias, which we might even call a bad leap of faith. Fact, when did science become equivalent to secularism, and why, he says? This is the nub of a major confusion for Western minds. And I refer you to the good writing of David Bentley Hart in The Experience of God, especially part 1, and Alvin Plantinga, Where the Conflict Really Lies. Plantinga particularly shows that the modern conflict is not between science and religion, but between religion and naturalism or materialism. So we're saying that this is part of the cloudy thinking of our day, and it needs to be cleared up. Here's a quote or two from David Bentley Hart on this issue. An admirably severe discipline of interpretive and theoretical restraint modern empirical science has been transformed into its perfect and irrepressibly wanton opposite. What began as a principled refusal of metaphysical speculation for the sake of specific empirical inquiries has now been mistaken for a comprehensive knowledge of the metaphysical shape of reality. The art of humble questioning has been mistaken for the sure possession of ultimate conclusions. This makes a mockery of real science. Satire works here as well, and Hart is great at that. So here's an example of the logic. Physics explains everything, which we know because anything physics cannot explain does not exist, which we know because whatever exists must be explicable by physics, which we know because physics explains everything. You can see the circular reasoning in that. So what about a different perspective? How can we open up this stifling frame to new possibilities? That's the crux of our argument today. So let's talk about transcendence and the immanent frame. What are the possibilities? And Taylor says that actually in our world today, both belief and unbelief coexist within society. Now we're back to the topic of Secularity 3. Here's his rebuttal. The story of the rise of modern social spaces doesn't need to be given an anti-religious spin. The actual reality of Western culture is closer to the truth than a whole gamut of positions from the most militant atheism to the most orthodox traditional theism, passing through every possible position on the way, are represented and defended somewhere in our society. They're defended in various contexts and communities. And here are some poets that talk about this issue. Blake, Goethe, and the Polish poet Milotz. So here are the two options within the immanent frame when we look at it from this perspective, the idea of the open immanent frame. A, those who opt for an ordered impersonal universe, a scientific materialistic form, or a more spiritualized variant, they feel the loss of a world of beauty, meaning, warmth, as well as of the perspective of self-transformation beyond the everyday. Albert Camus, the atheist existentialist, is a good example of this, where he said, I can't believe in God, but I sure wish he existed because we need him for the sake of our moral good and moral society. More on this later. B, the other option is those whose yearnings move them towards some search for spiritual meaning, often openness towards God. People reach outside of the immanent frame to access the transcendent, to open themselves to the divine, to epiphany, to higher meaning. And I point you to this very interesting series, CBC Ideas series with David Cayley called After Atheism, where they discuss this open frame option and some of the people that are involved in this debate. Good academic work by David Cayley. He also does a nice series on Taylor and the myth of the secular. This leads us to, again, another big picture question. It fits with what we've talked about so far, but it goes into a little more detail. We'll give an introduction of this and possibly do another video on explaining it in more detail. So there are two ways, says Taylor, of capturing reality, two philosophical engagements or two takes on reality. And this is written beautifully and elegantly in The Language Animal, his 2016 tome, which he says took him 30 years to write. So A is the epistemological outlook, and the philosophical roots of this are Descartes, Locke, and Hume. This is attuned to Secularity 2. Knowledge of self comes before knowledge of world. The individual alone attributes value to a neutral world. It has no value in and of itself. Knowledge of things in the natural world has priority over a theory of human existence. And so you can see that it's heavily influenced by science. It tends to problematize the religious or the metaphysical. And Taylor says that this is what's called designative language, pointing out things, separating things from one another, defining things. B is hermeneutical way of capturing reality or seeing reality. And this comes more from European thinkers like Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Gadamer. This is attuned to secularity 3. Society and the game of life come as prior to the self. So the game is already in play, in motion. Individual human players come second. There's no neutral grasp of things apart from their value. Our prime identity is as a new player introduced into an old game. You can see that it's a totally different outlook on how you see yourself and see the world and see knowledge. Transcendence can be part of the larger context within this approach. And this is called constitutive language. It focuses on human meaning, culture, identity, and the big picture. So these are two very important distinctions, and we'll go into a little more detail on them. So this is from the Language Animals, the cover of his book. First of all, the epistemological way. And I want to show that there's actually a theology of the epistemological way. Here, the self is an independent, disengaged subject, reflexively controlling its own thought processes self-responsibly. The so-called neutrality of this view remains in question, says Taylor. It is very value intensive, as we've already said. It offers a whole construction of identity and society with its own distinctive priorities and values. Its secularity 2 bias, closed box bias, ironically contains its own religious commitments and theological foundations. So says British social philosopher John Milbank, who rejects the idea of a secular social science, and American philosopher of culture, James K.A. Smith, in his book, The Nicene Option. Taylor sees this view, the epistemological way, as a retreat into the mind. It also contains the assumption of philosophical materialism, in that it's assuming that all that exists is based on matter alone. And it's a definite construction, not a logical fact or a consequence of science. You can't draw it from science. It's rather a story, he says, we tell ourselves over and over about the entire cosmos and our place within it, our value, identity, trajectory, and purpose. This is, at the end of the day, a metaphysical stance, as Hart signals. Why should mere matter be the last word to describe who we are, where we are, or why we are? The philosophical anthropology. Why do we buy the time, space, energy, matter construction as comprehensive or final? Why is it the last word? So this position tends to be rationalistic, excarnational, out of the body, mechanistic, morally self-authored, and it sometimes tends to be nihilistic, leading to the end of meaning. Here's a key quote again from David Bentley Hart about the false aura of the obviousness of the epistemological approach, or the closed immanent frame. Naturalistic materialism is a picture of the whole of reality that cannot, according to its own intrinsic premises, address the being of the whole. It is a metaphysics of the rejection of metaphysics, a transcendental certainty of the impossibility of transcendent truth, and so requires an act of pure credence, logically immune to any verification. Thus, naturalism must forever remain a pure assertion, a pure conviction, a confession of blind assurance in an inaccessible beyond. And that beyond, more paradoxically still, is the beyond of no beyond. So this adds weight to the idea that Taylor talks about the bias of naturalism, the bias of the closed immanent frame. What is the hermeneutical way of seeing, or the hermeneutical take on reality? Just a whole different approach to reality in a sense. This view is more open to God, culture, meaning, and religion. It exposes certain hard features of the epistemological perspective. And a good example of someone who's raised doubts or questions about the hard perspective of a closed immanent frame is Thomas Nagel, an atheist, in his book Mind and Cosmos, where he says consciousness, purpose, and morality are not fully explained by a purely materialistic outlook. He says it doesn't have the explanatory range necessary to really speak intelligently about these phenomena, non-reductionistically. So this is a view concisely articulated by Canadian scholar Jens Zimmerman in his book, Hermeneutics, a Very Short Introduction. I recommend that to you if you want an introduction to the whole language of hermeneutics. And just get that structure in your thinking about it. Very, very helpful for people to come to understand this way of thinking. Taylor takes seriously our sociocultural, historical embodiment, plus the communal and narrative aspects of our identity. It renders belief in the transcendent plausible as the largest dimension of our lived experience. So it's what we might call the out of the closed box view. So in a sense, to use Taylor's image of the box, in this case, the box is open. It allows us to discover things beyond the immanent frame from within. If we start within the immanent frame, we can actually be seekers and find supernatural things outside of the immanent frame, but connected to it. So science, although a highly respected methodology, was never designed in the end to be a worldview, an ontology of reductive materialism. This is a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. And David Bentley Hart has been good on this, as we've said. Also John Milbank in his book, Theology and Social Theory. So the hermeneutical way, the hermeneutical outlook, and you get more of this in Jens Zimmerman's book, the idea of incarnational humanism is one of his books that talks about this hermeneutical way. It's a very important book in his contribution to this topic. So this tends to be incarnational, culturally sensitive, interpretative, meaning-oriented, and more nuanced to lived experience. It takes lived experience seriously. So what are some conclusions from our discussion so far? And this has been an excellent overview and discussion of this important question of the myth of the secular in today's world. First, our discussion on secularity and the immanent frame has been very revealing of the background which conditions the way we think, infer, experience, process claims and arguments. Taylor says we are in pursuit of more spirituality today than ever before. This is the Nova effect. In order to make sense of our world, partly in reaction to the depressing cloud of contemporary nihilisms and transhumanism. Humans are religious animals all the way down. The closed immanent frame harmfully eclipses dialogue about other dimensions to reality. It renders us inarticulate concerning very pertinent matters of our identity and our world. So we lack full language capacity. In some senses, we're autistic or speechless when it comes to things outside of the closed immanent frame. It makes them disappear. So it's a funny set of glasses because it clouds out certain things. Religion has a very significant role in society today in late modernity. recognized by many while being disputed or contested by others, like the new atheists. Hermeneutics opens this discussion in a powerful way. It allows us to build on this in a future presentation. I think we do need a presentation on hermeneutics. And finally, Taylor has exposed the myth of secularity too, and deconstructed the subtraction story that science has replaced religion in late modernity. Science is good, but a properly limited epistemology or way to discover knowledge. It's not an ontology or description of the whole world. And I recommend to you this video by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who is actually now passed on, but left this as a heritage. His reflection on two popular books adds a sense of cultural urgency to our discussion. The book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, which is quite popular. And the other book is The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray. I think what Rabbi Sacks has said is that there is a certain urgency in the definition of the frame in which we think and live, and how it can sustain us, sustain our rights, and sustain human flourishing going forward. So here's our bibliography, our sources for this discussion. I won't go into all the details, but you can follow up if you want to look into them on your own time. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me in this session. It's been a pleasure being with you, guiding you through some of this important discussion from Charles Taylor. Gives you a bit of a thumbnail sketch of his brilliant mind on understanding the secular in our day and age within this immanent frame that we live in today. Thank you so much, and all the best in your thinking and your living.